The town had seen better days. Once filled with laughter, music, and bright shop windows, it now seemed quiet in the wrong way. Streets were empty most of the time, and the people who lived there moved about with their heads down, lost in their own worries. Small businesses had closed, houses were weathered and chipped, and a sense of sadness hung over the town like a thick fog. Neighbors rarely spoke to each other. Old arguments remained unresolved, and the weight of disappointment seemed to touch everyone who walked these streets. In the middle of all this, the community center stood quietly. Its walls were cracked and paint peeled from the doors. Inside, the lights flickered sometimes and the furniture creaked with age. No one visited it much anymore except for a few regulars and the janitor who worked there. He was a quiet man, middle-aged, with lines on his face that spoke of years of labor and a hint of sadness in his eyes. His clothes were plain, his movements careful, and he never drew attention to himself. People who saw him passing on the streets barely noticed. He was just part of the town's background, like the faded benches or the old street lamps. The janitor had a routine. Every morning he arrived early, swept the floors, wiped the tables, and dusted the corners. He mopped the floors until they shone faintly under the dim lights. He fixed broken chairs and rearranged tables for the few visitors who might come for meetings or classes. He did his work silently, moving from one task to another without complaint, without drawing anyone's attention. Most of the time he felt invisible, and in a town like this, being invisible was both a shield and a burden. What nobody knew, however, was that the janitor carried a secret. It was something he had hidden for many years, something so personal that even his closest acquaintances at work did not suspect it. After the last light in the center went out, after the few remaining visitors had left and the doors were locked for the night, he would move to the old piano tucked away in the corner of the main hall. The piano was ancient. Its wood was scratched and faded. The keys yellowed with age, and a few notes refused to sound correctly no matter how carefully they were pressed. Most people had long ignored it, thinking it was nothing more than a piece of forgotten furniture. But to the janitor it was everything. He would sit before it, hands hovering for a moment, and then slowly begin to play. The music started quietly, almost like a whisper, filling the empty hall with sound. He played songs from his past, melodies that reminded him of times when life felt lighter, when laughter was common, and when people were more connected. Sometimes the notes were joyful and hopeful. Other times they carried a soft sadness, a longing that seemed to resonate with the town itself. He closed his eyes as he played, letting the music flow naturally, unthinking but with deep feeling. The sound of the piano became a language through which he spoke, a way to release emotions he could not say aloud. Most nights, he was alone. The town had long gone to sleep and the streets were dark and silent. But sometimes he noticed faint movements near the windows. People would pause, drawn by the music, standing in doorways or peering out quietly, listening without ever stepping inside. He did not know who they were at first. He kept playing, lost in the music, and slowly he realized that the notes reached beyond the walls, reaching the people who needed it most. The janitor remembered the town before it became so distant. He remembered children playing in the streets, friends laughing together, neighbors sharing food and stories on warm evenings. Life had been simple, but it had been full of connection. Over the years, the town had changed. Work had disappeared, people had left in search of better opportunities, and disagreements had festered. Small fights over property, money, or misunderstandings had turned neighbors into strangers. Families barely spoke to each other. The janitor knew these changes all too well because he had seen them happen slowly, like a quiet river carving a deep scar. Even with all that, he had hope. He believed that people could still feel joy if something gentle and beautiful reached them, if something reminded them of what they had once known. That was why he continued to play night after night, never expecting recognition or praise. He played for the town even when the town did not know it. One evening, after finishing his chores, he sat down at the piano with a quiet sigh. The hall was still, the shadows stretching long across the walls. He began with a slow melody, soft and tender, almost like a lullaby. The notes floated through the air, carrying warmth and emotion. Outside, a neighbor walking home slowed his pace, pausing to listen. Across the street, a mother holding her child stopped on the porch, the child's eyes wide as they heard the music. An elderly man leaning on his cane let out a deep breath, feeling a strange comfort he could not name. The janitor played without thinking about who was listening. Each note was chosen from his heart, each pause deliberate. He did not rush. He let the music stretch, fill the corners of the hall, and spill gently into the night. Hours could pass, but he would continue, letting the melodies tell stories that words could never capture. In those quiet moments, he felt alive in a way he did not during the day. During the day, he was just a janitor, a background figure in a town that seemed to have forgotten how to smile. But at night, with his fingers dancing over the keys, he became a storyteller, a healer, a presence that could reach hearts without ever being seen. The music connected him to the town in ways words could not. He remembered why he had left his old life behind. Once he had performed in grand halls, played for crowds who applauded, and traveled to cities he had only dreamed about as a child. But life had taken a hard turn, and personal loss had driven him to seek a quiet existence. The piano in the community center was modest, old, and imperfect, but it was a home for his music and a sanctuary for his heart. Some nights, after playing, he would step outside, the cool night air brushing his face. He would see small lights flickering in houses along the streets. He wondered if the people inside had noticed him, if they felt a spark of emotion, a memory, a smile that returned unexpectedly. He never asked, never waited for feedback. It was enough to know that the music had somewhere to go, that it could touch invisible lives in ways that might never be spoken aloud. As weeks passed, small changes began to happen in the town, though people did not realize why. A neighbor who had been angry with another over a fence line stopped arguing. Two old friends who had not spoken in years met at the store and exchanged a quiet, tentative smile. Children played outside a little longer, laughter echoing softly. Nobody could explain it, but slowly the town seemed a little lighter, a little less broken. The janitor never took credit. He never told anyone about the nights spent at the piano. It was his secret, a gift shared silently with the town. Even if no one knew, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. The piano allowed him to give something meaningful, something that could outlast the bitterness and pain that had settled over the town. Sometimes, when he played, he imagined the town as it could be. Streets alive with conversation, families gathering in parks, neighbors helping each other, smiles returning to faces that had grown serious over time. Music was his hope, a gentle reminder that even in a place that seemed lost, beauty could exist and hearts could still connect. And so, night after night, he continued. He arrived early, cleaned the floors, arranged the tables, and then, when the hall was empty, he sat before the piano and let his soul speak. The town remained unaware of the quiet miracle happening in their midst. They only felt its effects slowly, without realizing where it came from. It was a small act, yet it carried power, a single man, a forgotten piano, and the courage to play for no one but the invisible ears of a weary town. In the silence of the hall, in the echo of each note, a story began to unfold. A story of hope, of connection, of healing that no one yet could see. And in that quiet hall, the janitor played on, unaware that the first threads of change were already weaving through the broken heart of the town. The town continued to move slowly through its days, heavy with silence and unspoken worries, but something had started to change. It was subtle at first. People noticed it only when they paused for a moment and listened. A soft melody would drift through the air in the evenings, carried by the wind, brushing past windows and doors. No one could say where it came from, and yet everyone felt it. It was as if the town itself had a heartbeat that had been missing for years, and the music brought it back. At first, many people dismissed it. They assumed it was a radio from someone's house or a neighbor practicing quietly. Others thought it might be the hum of an old machine or perhaps even their imagination. But the notes were too clear, too purposeful to be random. There was warmth in them, sadness and hope woven together, and it was impossible not to notice. People began to pause on the streets in the evenings, tilting their heads as the soft sound reached them. Children stopped playing to listen, and even the adults, who had long forgotten how to enjoy small moments, found themselves standing quietly, drawn in by the invisible pull of the music. The janitor never knew that people were listening. He played in the same quiet way he always had, allowing the piano to speak what words could not. He poured all of his feelings into the notes, the memories of his past, the losses he had endured, the hope he still carried for the town he loved in secret. The music was for no one, yet it began to reach everyone. One evening, a woman walking home from the grocery store stopped in her tracks. She leaned against the fence at the corner of her yard, her hands gripping the rail, and listened. The melody was soft but full of emotion, and she felt herself taken back to a time when life had been simpler. She remembered the days when children ran in the streets without worry, when neighbors greeted each other with smiles, and when the town felt alive. Her eyes grew misty as she realized that she had missed that feeling more than she had thought. She did not know where the music came from, but it reminded her that even in dark times, something beautiful could still exist. A little further down the street, an elderly man leaned heavily on his cane, listening without moving. He had lived in the town his whole life and had seen it change over the decades. He had seen businesses close, friends leave, and families drift apart. He had seen arguments turn neighbors into strangers and bitterness replace kindness. He had almost given up hope. But tonight, the music stirred something inside him, something he thought had disappeared long ago. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel, remembering moments of laughter and community that had seemed lost forever. Even the children were affected. A small group of them, who had grown up in a town where silence was normal, started whispering to each other about the mysterious music. They would sneak out at dusk, gathering near windows or standing under streetlights to hear the notes. They did not know who was playing, and they did not care. They only knew that the music made them feel alive and curious in a way that school and chores never could. At first, there were skeptics. A few neighbors scoffed and said it was nothing, just noise or coincidence. A shopkeeper even grumbled one evening about people wasting time listening to imaginary concerts. But even he could not escape the effect of the music. He found himself pausing longer at the counter, humming a tune he could not place, feeling a warmth he had not felt in years. Slowly, the music began to soften the hardened edges of the town, reaching people who had long forgotten how to enjoy a simple moment. Rumors began to circulate quietly, carried by those who had noticed the sound. "Have you heard the piano at night?" someone would ask. "It's beautiful, like something from the past," another would reply. Nobody knew who played it, but the mystery made the town feel alive again. People began walking outside a little longer in the evenings, lingering on their porches or in front of their houses just to hear the music. They started to notice one another again, a nod here, a smile there. The music was slowly opening doors that had been closed for years. The janitor continued his work during the day, still quiet and unassuming. No one suspected the man they had seen sweeping the floors and fixing chairs at the community center was the source of the magic. He kept to himself, smiling faintly at visitors, helping anyone who needed it but never drawing attention. It was a delicate balance. He did not want praise, and he did not want the music to become a spectacle. The beauty of it was in its simplicity, in the way it could reach hearts quietly without fanfare. One night, a young teenager, curious and bold, decided to follow the sound. They tiptoed along the quiet streets, careful not to make a sound, letting the music guide them. It was faint at first, then clearer as they approached the community center. They pressed their ear to the door, heart beating fast, and listened to the music filling the empty hall. Their eyes widened in wonder and a smile spread across their face. They had never heard anything like it before. The notes were alive, almost as if the piano itself had a soul. The teenager returned night after night, drawn to the music and to the feelings it stirred inside them. They could not tell anyone, fearing it would ruin the magic. But they were not the only ones. Slowly, others began to discover the hall, carefully, quietly. People did not enter in large numbers. They were too shy, too unsure. But they found small ways to listen, to share the experience with friends and family. Each evening, a few more would pause to hear the piano, feeling the warmth and hope that had been missing for so long. Something remarkable began to happen. People started to remember each other. Old neighbors who had argued over small matters began to nod politely when they passed on the street. Strangers began to smile at one another. Even those who had been angry or bitter found themselves softened by the music. Conversations started again, quietly at first, about nothing important, just a shared moment, a shared feeling. The town, which had been heavy with sadness and isolation, began to feel lighter, almost imperceptibly. The janitor, unaware of the growing audience, felt something himself. The music seemed to carry the weight of the town, taking the sadness and turning it into something gentle, something that could heal. As he played, he imagined the town not as it was, but as it could be. He imagined people laughing together, neighbors sharing meals, children playing safely in the streets. Each note was a hope, a quiet wish, a dream for a town that had almost forgotten how to be alive. Sometimes, he would pause mid-song, listening to the echo in the empty hall, wondering if anyone was out there hearing it. The wind would stir the leaves outside, and he imagined that the town itself was listening, that every window and door was a small ear, catching the music and letting it weave through the hearts of those who lived there. He felt a connection he had never known before, a quiet bond with the people he had served silently for so many years. As the nights passed, the town slowly began to change in ways no one could quite explain. A small child helped an elderly neighbor carry groceries. A young man offered to fix a fence for someone he had once argued with, and families began spending more time outside in the evenings, talking, laughing, and sharing stories. Nobody knew why they felt drawn together, only that something had shifted, something gentle and powerful that reminded them that life could still be beautiful. Even the skeptics found themselves affected. The shopkeeper who had once grumbled about imaginary concerts found himself humming a tune from nowhere, smiling at a stranger in the street. A woman who had spent years avoiding her neighbor found herself sharing a pie she had baked, feeling a warmth she had not felt in a long time. The music was doing what words could not. It was healing, slowly, quietly, and invisibly, reaching the town through the hands of a man who played for no one in particular, yet for everyone at the same time. The janitor did not know how far his music had reached. He did not know the smiles it had sparked, the hearts it had touched, or the small acts of kindness it had inspired. He only knew that he played, and in the playing he felt alive. In the music he found purpose and connection, a bridge between himself and a town that had almost given up hope. And so night after night he continued. The town slept, walked, and lived, carrying with them a warmth they could not explain, a gentle reminder that even in quiet, ordinary places, something extraordinary could exist. The music remained a secret to most, a whisper in the dark that softened the edges of life and reminded the people that they were not as alone as they had thought. The town, once heavy and broken, had begun to stir. A melody in the night, played by a quiet janitor who asked for nothing in return, had begun to awaken the hearts of its people. And though no one knew it yet, the music was only the beginning. It was the first note in a story that would change the town forever. The first spark of hope in a place that had almost forgotten how to shine. The mysterious music continued to drift through the town every evening, wrapping around corners, slipping through windows, and resting lightly on the streets. It was no longer just a passing curiosity. People had begun to notice patterns. Every night, without fail, the same gentle melodies would rise from somewhere in the quiet town, soft but full of emotion, pulling at the hearts of anyone who would stop to listen. The town had started to awaken in small, subtle ways, but no one knew who was behind the music. One evening, a young teenager decided to finally solve the mystery. They had been hearing the piano for weeks now, and curiosity had grown too strong to resist. Carefully, they followed the sound, tiptoeing down empty streets, guided only by the faint notes floating in the night air. Their heart pounded with excitement and a little fear. They did not know what they would find, only that they had to know who could create something so beautiful. As they approached the community center, the music became clearer, more alive. The doors were locked and the hall was dark, but through the windows they could see a faint silhouette. There he was, the janitor, sitting at the old piano, his hands moving gracefully over the keys. The teenager froze, amazed. The quiet man they had seen during the day, the one who swept floors and mopped the hall without drawing attention, was the source of all this magic. They could hardly believe it. The teenager stayed hidden in the shadows, listening in silence. Every note seemed to carry a story, and for the first time in weeks they felt something they had almost forgotten. Hope. The music spoke to them in ways words never could. They noticed the small movements of the janitor as he played, the way his eyes closed, the way his body swayed gently with the rhythm. It was clear he was not just playing notes, he was pouring his soul into every sound. Word began to spread quietly among those who had noticed the music. People whispered to friends and family, sharing their experiences without revealing too much. "Have you heard it tonight?" they would ask. "It's so beautiful," someone else would reply. Curiosity grew and more people started looking for the source, though most stayed at a distance, unsure if they should enter the community center. The music had created a mystery that brought the town together in quiet fascination. Meanwhile, the janitor remained unaware of the growing attention. He played as he always had, lost in the melodies, imagining the town as it could be. Every note was a wish, a dream, a memory, and a hope. He did not play for recognition, for applause, or for reward. The music was private, sacred, and personal, yet somehow it had begun to reach others in ways he could not see. One night, a small group of neighbors gathered outside the center, hidden behind trees and fences just to listen. They whispered to each other, marveling at the talent and emotion pouring from the old piano. Some were older residents, curious and cautious. Some were young adults drawn by a mixture of wonder and hope. None of them dared to enter, afraid of disturbing the magic, yet they all felt the connection growing between them. They did not know each other well, yet for a brief time, the music made them feel like a single community again. A woman who lived nearby began leaving her porch light on, hoping that perhaps the pianist might notice. She never spoke of it, even to her family. She just wanted to be close enough to hear the music more clearly, to feel it without interruption. One night her daughter joined her, and they sat together silently, listening as the notes carried over the fence and into their small garden. It became their routine, a quiet ritual that brought them peace and a sense of belonging in a town that had grown lonely. The teenager who had first discovered the janitor's secret could not stop thinking about it. They returned night after night, hiding in the shadows, absorbing the music and watching the way it seemed to change the night itself. Something about the pianist's quiet presence, his focus, and the tenderness in each note fascinated them. They wondered how someone could live such an ordinary life during the day, and yet create something so extraordinary in secret. It felt like discovering a hidden treasure that belonged to the whole town, but was guarded by a single person. Curiosity began to build not only about the music, but about the pianist himself. Who was he? Why did he play only at night? How could someone with such talent live so quietly, unnoticed by the entire town? The questions spread slowly, whispered among neighbors, discussed softly in shops and homes. The music had become a topic of fascination and speculation, drawing the town into a shared mystery that no one could resist. Despite the growing interest, the janitor continued to play without acknowledging his audience. He never glanced toward the windows, never paused to ask who might be listening. For him, the music was a conversation with the town, an offering of hope and comfort without expectation. Each night he poured everything into the piano, the memories of his youth, the regrets he carried, the quiet dreams he still hoped to realize. And the town, without realizing it, began to respond. People started to take small steps toward each other. A neighbor who had once ignored a complaint from another now paused to nod politely. Friends who had drifted apart met on the street and exchanged tentative smiles. Even those who had long held grudges found themselves softened by the invisible influence of the music. It was subtle at first, a word here, a gesture there, but it marked the beginning of change. The music was weaving its way through the town, touching hearts that had been closed off for years. One evening, a teacher who lived nearby could not resist any longer. She had been hearing the piano for weeks and was amazed by the emotion it carried. Quietly, she approached the community center, curious and a little nervous. She pressed her hand against the doorframe and listened, feeling the music wash over her like a gentle wave. Memories of her own childhood, of simpler days filled with laughter and warmth, came rushing back. She realized how much the town had lost, and for the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. The teenager finally decided to reveal the secret to a close friend. They wanted someone to share the wonder with, someone who could understand the feeling it brought. Together, they began to watch and listen, careful not to disturb the pianist. They noticed small details, the way his fingers moved with precision, the subtle pauses, the changes in tempo that reflected emotion. They began to understand that the music was more than just notes on a page. It was a story, a conversation, a gift. The town began to feel lighter. People did not know why, and they did not understand how it was happening, but they sensed a shift. Small arguments ended more quickly. Neighbors offered help without being asked, and strangers began exchanging smiles and greetings. The music had begun to reach beyond the ears of those who listened. It was reaching into hearts, creating connections that had been missing for years. The town, which had been heavy and silent, was slowly awakening. Even the most skeptical residents could not deny the effect. The shopkeeper, who had once mocked the idea of a piano at night, found himself humming the melodies he had overheard. He noticed himself smiling more often, listening to the laughter of children on the streets with a warmth he had not felt in years. The music was breaking down barriers, reminding people of the humanity they shared, even in a town divided by time, neglect, and forgotten grievances. One night, the janitor played later than usual. He lost track of time, carried away by the emotions that flowed through him and the piano. The notes were gentle but insistent, a story of longing, hope, and connection. As he played, he imagined the town as it could be, a place of warmth, laughter, and togetherness. Without knowing it, his music was beginning to inspire the first steps toward that vision. People outside felt it too, lingering on porches, whispering to each other, and feeling a sense of belonging that had been absent for years. The teenager and their friend continued to watch, fascinated. They began to think about how the music could be shared more, how the town could experience it together. Yet they were careful not to disturb the pianist, respecting the secret that had given them so much. They realized that sometimes the most powerful things in life are not announced or celebrated. They are felt quietly, deeply, and personally. The music was doing just that, touching lives without forcing attention, connecting hearts without words. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the town began to change. A woman offered to help her neighbor with chores she had long ignored. Children started inviting one another to play outside again. Friends who had avoided each other for years began meeting, first cautiously, then with genuine warmth. The music had become more than sound. It was a thread, weaving the community together, reminding people of what had been missing and what could still exist. And the janitor played on, unaware of the growing web of connection he had created. Each note was a gift, a quiet offering of hope and love. He had no idea that the town was watching. That curiosity and admiration had begun to spread like a gentle ripple. He only knew the music, the piano, and the feelings that poured through him. And that was enough, for now. The town, once lonely and broken, was starting to feel alive again. People could not explain why, and they could not yet name the source of the change, but they sensed it. A quiet man with an old piano was reminding them of something they had forgotten, that beauty, hope, and connection could exist even in the darkest of times. And in the shadowed streets under the glow of dim lights, the first true stirrings of a town coming back to life were beginning, note by note, sound by sound, heart by heart. The town was quietly changing, though no one had yet spoken openly about it. People felt it in the evenings when they paused to listen, in the way they smiled at neighbors they had ignored for years, and in the small kindnesses that began to appear almost instinctively. The music had touched something deep inside, something that words could not reach. It had become a gentle pulse, weaving through lives like a quiet thread, reminding people of warmth, connection, and hope. One evening, the janitor finished his chores and sat at the piano as usual. But that night there was something different in the air. A small crowd had gathered, hidden in the shadows at first, then inching closer as the notes drifted through the hall. They were quiet, careful not to startle him, watching the simple, unassuming man who had become their secret hero without realizing it. The music flowed through the empty hall, soft but full of life, and for the first time, the janitor sensed that he was not alone. A young teenager who had been following him for weeks stepped forward timidly. I think we've been listening," they said softly, barely above a whisper. The janitor paused, surprised, his hand still hovering above the keys. He looked up, meeting the wide-eyed gaze of the teenager. There was no anger in their expression, no demand, only admiration and wonder. The janitor felt a rush of emotion, unsure what to say. He had played for no one, and yet here was someone brave enough to face him, acknowledging his music. The teenager explained how many people had been hearing the music, how it had brought them together in ways they could not yet explain. They spoke of neighbors smiling again, children playing outside, and old friends reconnecting. The janitor listened quietly, a lump in his throat. He had not realized how far his music had traveled, how deeply it had touched the hearts of the town. For years he had played in solitude, thinking it was just a personal outlet. Now, he understood that his music had begun to heal more than just his own soul. It had begun to heal the town itself. Word of the discovery spread carefully. People were still cautious, not wanting to intrude, but they wanted to witness it, to be part of the quiet magic that had been reshaping their community. One by one, neighbors began to gather in the hall quietly, respectfully, keeping a distance, listening and watching as the janitor played. He was hesitant at first, unsure if he should perform in front of anyone. His life had been built around quiet observation and anonymity, and suddenly being seen made him nervous. But the faces around him, the quiet attention, the palpable warmth in the air, it made him realize that this moment was bigger than his fear. As he played, the hall seemed to transform. The notes carried through the air, filling every corner, weaving into the hearts of those who listened. People who had never spoken to each other now shared glances, smiles, and tears. A mother held her child close, the child's small fingers brushing the edge of the piano, fascinated by the music. An elderly man leaned on his cane, eyes closed, letting memories wash over him. Friends who had been distant for years reached for each other's hands, unsure why, but knowing that something in this moment made them want to connect. The janitor began to feel something he had not felt in years, a sense of belonging. The music was no longer just his secret. It had become a shared experience, a bridge connecting him to the people he had cared for quietly, from the background. And the town in return seemed to embrace him, not as the janitor who swept floors and cleaned chairs, but as someone who had brought beauty, hope, and life back to their community. The evening continued, and more people arrived, drawn by the music, by curiosity, or simply by the word-of-mouth whispers that had begun to circulate. Some were hesitant, standing in the doorway, unsure if they should enter. Others, braver, took seats in the hall, listening with rapt attention. Nobody spoke over the music. Nobody clapped or demanded recognition. It was as if everyone understood that the moment was too fragile to break. They simply let the music carry them, allowing it to heal and connect in ways that words could not. The janitor's fingers moved over the keys with ease and grace. Every note was deliberate, every pause intentional. He began to play songs that told stories of the town itself, of its hardships, its quiet victories, its moments of lost joy, and its small, persistent hope. People could feel the stories in their hearts. Some wept quietly, others smiled softly, and a few even laughed softly at memories the music stirred. The hall, once empty and silent, had become a place of shared emotion, a space where the town could breathe together. A teacher, who had been listening from the street for weeks, finally stepped inside. She approached slowly, unsure if she should interrupt, but as she saw the janitor playing and the way the townspeople were absorbed in the music, she realized that she did not need to speak. She simply took a seat at the back and allowed herself to be part of the moment. The music seemed to reach her as well, unlocking memories she had almost forgotten, of her own childhood, of laughter with neighbors, of simple joys she had overlooked in the rush of everyday life. Even the skeptics were touched. The shopkeeper, who had once laughed at the idea of a piano at night, found himself sitting quietly in the corner, listening, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through him. He remembered the days when he had smiled freely, when neighbors had greeted him with kindness, and he realized that the music was giving him a chance to remember, to reconnect. He noticed the way people around him were changing too, their expressions softening, their postures relaxing. The music was doing what arguments and words had failed to do. It was opening hearts. The janitor began to understand that he could help the town not just with his music, but by allowing people to share in it. Slowly he started to acknowledge the listeners, offering small nods, subtle smiles, and even gentle introductions. "I'm glad you're here," he would say quietly to those who approached him. The town responded with gratitude and warmth. The music became a shared ritual, something people could come together for without fear of judgment, without need for grand speeches or performances. Evenings became special. Families would bring blankets and sit quietly on the floor. Children would peek curiously at the piano, learning to recognize notes and rhythms. Neighbors who had avoided each other for years began to speak, sharing small stories, food, or laughter. The community center, once a place of neglect and emptiness, was now alive with connection. And all of it was sparked by the quiet man who had never asked for attention, who had simply shared his music with a town that had almost forgotten how to feel. One night, as the janitor finished a particularly tender piece, a hush fell over the hall. People sat quietly, letting the last notes linger in the air. Then, almost instinctively, they began to clap softly, a few at first, then more, until the hall was filled with quiet, respectful applause. The janitor looked around, feeling a warmth he had never known. He had never imagined that his music could have such an effect, that it could bring people together, that it could give life back to a town that had been lost in silence. From that night on, the music was no longer a secret. People came intentionally, looking for comfort, for connection, for the quiet magic that only the piano and its player could provide. The town slowly began to heal in ways that could not be measured by money or projects. Old wounds began to mend. Neighbors helped each other with repairs, shared meals, and spent evenings talking and laughing. Children played outside longer, families spent time together, and strangers greeted each other with smiles. The town was alive again, and the janitor's music had made it possible. He continued to play every night, but now he did not feel alone. The town had become part of the music. Faces, smiles, and quiet gestures of gratitude filled the hall with energy. People did not just listen, they felt, remembered, and connected. And the janitor realized that his gift was not only about playing the piano, it was about creating space for people to come together, to feel and to share in something greater than themselves. The community center became a place of gathering. Not for grand events, not for announcements or performances, but simply to be together, to listen, to share, and to connect. The town had learned to value quiet beauty, to recognize the power of something as simple as music, and to remember that hope could exist, even in the darkest corners. The janitor, once invisible, had become the heart of a slowly mending town, and so the evenings continued. The piano played, the town listened, and little by little the broken pieces of a community began to come together again. People laughed, cried, and smiled together. Old friends reconnected. Families spent time together. Neighbors became neighbors again. And the quiet janitor, who had given nothing but music, saw the power of one small gift to transform not just hearts, but an entire town. The town had changed. It was not a sudden transformation, but a quiet, steady one, built note by note, evening by evening, through the music of a man who had once lived unnoticed. Streets that had been empty were now filled with small sounds of life. Children's laughter, neighbors talking, the clinking of dishes as families shared meals outside. The once broken town felt lighter, warmer, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. People could not explain why it felt different, only that something had sparked the town back to life. The janitor continued his routine, arriving early to sweep the floors, arrange chairs, and clean the hall. Yet now, unlike before, he did not feel invisible. People greeted him warmly, thanked him softly for the music, and sometimes lingered just to watch him work. He had never sought recognition, and he still did not need it. But there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the joy that had begun to bloom around him. The community center, once neglected, had become a place of gathering, and he had become a figure of quiet admiration and respect. Evenings became a ritual for the town. Families, children, neighbors, and friends gathered in the hall to listen to the piano. Some arrived shyly, hesitant to intrude, but the warmth in the air drew them closer. Each evening felt different, alive with emotion, yet familiar and comforting. The music carried stories not only of the janitor's memories, but of the town itself. The struggles, the joys, the lost moments, and the hopes that had persisted quietly. People came not just to hear the notes, but to feel them, to reconnect with their own hearts and with each other. One evening, the janitor played a song that seemed to speak to the town in a way he had never tried before. It was slower, softer, and somehow heavier with meaning. The notes seemed to stretch through the hall, touching each listener in a unique way. Some cried softly, remembering lost loved ones or old friends. Some smiled quietly, thinking of moments they had long forgotten. And some simply sat in awe, feeling a connection to people around them that they had never felt before. The music became more than entertainment. It became a language of emotion that no one could ignore. The townspeople began to share their stories more openly. They spoke about the times they had been angry, lonely, or hurt, and slowly, in the gentle space created by the music, forgiveness began to flow. Old disputes were resolved, neighbors helped one another, and friendships were rekindled. The music had created a safe place for people to feel, to connect, and to heal. No one could have predicted that a single piano in a quiet hall could carry such power, but it had done exactly that. Even children began to notice the changes. They played together in ways they had not before, sharing toys, games, and laughter. Parents noticed the joy returning to their faces and felt the warmth spreading through their own hearts. Stories were told again, lessons were shared, and a sense of community that had been lost for years was slowly returning. The town had become alive not because of money or programs, but because people had begun to feel again, to remember how it felt to be connected. The janitor, who had spent years in solitude, began to understand the depth of what he had started. He had not planned to heal a town, nor had he even considered it. He had simply played the piano, letting his own emotions pour out, and yet through his music, he had reminded people of their own humanity, of their own capacity for kindness, connection, and hope. He realized that sometimes the simplest acts done quietly and sincerely could create the most profound impact. One evening, a group of townspeople approached him with an idea. They wanted to hold a special event, a celebration of the music that had brought them back together. At first, the janitor hesitated. He had never wanted attention, never wanted applause, and certainly never imagined being at the center of such a gathering. But the town insisted, explaining that this was not about him alone but about the community he had helped to heal. It was about celebrating the connections they had rebuilt, the laughter they had regained, and the hope they had rediscovered. The day of the event arrived. The hall was filled with people of all ages. Families, neighbors, old friends, and even those who had once been strangers came together, drawn by the music and by the desire to celebrate what it had done for them. The atmosphere was warm and alive, buzzing with quiet excitement and shared joy. The janitor sat at the piano, hands hovering over the keys, feeling a mixture of nerves and gratitude. He had never performed in front of an audience like this before, and yet he knew this was not a performance, it was a gift, a way to give back to the people who had embraced him and each other. He began to play, softly at first, letting the notes fill the hall. As the music flowed, people listened with rapt attention, some with tears in their eyes, some with smiles on their faces, and some simply swaying gently to the rhythm. The sound of the piano carried stories of the town, the sadness, the struggles, the joys, and the slow rebuilding of trust and connection. Every note seemed to speak directly to each listener, reminding them of the power of togetherness and the importance of hope. As the evening progressed, people began to join in quietly. Children hummed along with the melodies, neighbors whispered memories to one another, and small acts of kindness rippled through the crowd. The music had become a living thread, tying people together in a way that words could not. The janitor looked around, seeing faces lit with warmth and connection, and he realized that his secret gift had grown into something far greater than he had ever imagined. After the final note faded into silence, the hall remained quiet for a moment, as if everyone was holding their breath, savoring the lingering feeling of togetherness. Then slowly the audience began to clap, softly at first, then more confidently, until the hall was filled with applause. It was not applause for the janitor alone, but for the music, for the healing it had brought, and for the sense of community it had restored. The janitor felt tears prick his eyes, a mix of humility and joy. He had never sought recognition, and yet he could not deny the deep sense of fulfillment that came from seeing the town united, happy, and alive again. The celebration became a turning point for the town. The community center, once forgotten, became a place of regular gatherings. Music nights, storytelling, and shared meals became part of life once more. People discovered the value of connection and learned to care for one another in ways they had forgotten. The town, once broken and heavy with silence, had found a rhythm of life and warmth again. And at the center of it all was the janitor, whose quiet dedication to his music had reminded them all of the power of simple, heartfelt actions. The janitor himself changed as well. He had spent years in solitude, hiding from the world, burdened by past losses and the weight of invisibility. But now he felt a sense of belonging that he had never known. People greeted him warmly, invited him to meals, and shared their stories with him. He had become more than a janitor. He had become a guide, a quiet leader, and a symbol of hope for the town. His music had not only healed others, but had healed him as well, giving him a renewed sense of purpose and joy. Over time, the town's transformation deepened. Shops reopened as neighbors supported local businesses. Streets once empty with silence were now filled with conversations, laughter, and shared meals. Families spent evenings together outside. Neighbors checked in on one another, and children played freely without fear. The sense of isolation that had defined the town for years melted away, replaced by warmth, trust, and connection. All of it traced back to the quiet janitor and the music he shared selflessly. Even years later, the memory of the first nights at the piano remained vivid. People spoke of the early days when they first noticed the music drifting through the town, how it had sparked curiosity, hope, and wonder. They remembered the shy, quiet janitor who had become the heart of their community, without ever demanding attention. And they told their children and grandchildren about the power of small, meaningful actions, about how one person's gift could heal many, and about the beauty of listening, feeling, and connecting with one another. The janitor continued to play for the town, not out of obligation, but out of love. Each note was a reminder that even in the darkest times there was light. Each melody carried the memory of a town that had been lost and then found again, a town that had learned to care for itself and for one another. The music was no longer a secret, and it never needed to be. It had become a living legacy, a story of hope, kindness, and the extraordinary power of a simple, quiet heart. And so, the town thrived. Not because of wealth, politics, or grand plans, but because one man shared his gift sincerely, and the people around him were open enough to receive it. The music had taught them to listen, to feel, and to reconnect. It had taught them that even the quietest, most overlooked among them could spark extraordinary change. And in that town where streets once lay empty and hearts once closed, life returned fully, gently, and beautifully, one note at a time.